Okay, so chapter 13, personality disorders. So before we talk about personality disorder, I want to take a minute and define what is personality. Personality is defined as a set of uniquely expressed characteristics, which we will talk about in a second, that influence our behaviors, emotions, thoughts, and interactions. So the idea here is that we have a set of characteristics that make up who we are. And these characteristics help influence our behavior, what we do, what we feel, what we think, and even how we interact with other people. These characteristics are often called personality traits. So here we have personality traits, and there's a lot of different ways that we can describe, or a lot of different types of traits that we could define. One of the most common and widely accepted ways of listing our traits is what's known as the Big Five. So the Big Five, the acronym is OCEAN. So OCEAN being openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So the idea is that we all exist somewhere on a continuum on each of these. So we vary in degree of openness, we vary in degree of conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and then vary in with respect to neuroticism. So our personality also suggests that when we have a healthy personality, our traits lead us to react in fairly predictable ways. So when we're in various situations, given our traits, where we are on these five continuum, then we can typically predict how we would behave, or typically predict how we would think. And it's fairly predictable because, yeah, there's going to be variation, right? So in social situations, I am more of an introvert, but when it comes to teaching, right, in that social situation, I have to be more of an extrovert because that's what the situation demands. So yes, the definition of personality recognizes that, we can't 100% predict how people would act or think or how they would, behave socially, but it's fairly predictable. And this is what's meant by how these traits are fairly, how these traits are flexible, right? So people with a healthy personality, they can vary in these different dimensions. Even though we might be, the majority of the time we might be an introvert, for example, we are able to be flexible given a situation and perhaps be a little bit more extroverted when that situation demands. With respect to causes, with respect to what leads to these different traits, what influences us to be where we are on the continuum of these five traits can be inherited. I mean, there's some evidence that we have traits we have because it's genetic, and there's also evidence to suggest that these traits can be learned. They can be learned from parents, but they could also be learned from other significant people in our lives, siblings, caregivers, peers, media influences, etc. So a lot of different factors come into play when we're trying to explain where the traits came from. So with respect to a personality disorder, here are the DSM criteria from your book. And criterion 1 here states that the individual displays long-term, rigid, and wide-ranging pattern of inner experience and behavior. So inner experience, meaning your thoughts and your emotions, as well as your behavior. So outward presentation as well. And this leads to dysfunction in at least two of the following realms. So this long-term, rigid, wide-ranging pattern leads to dysfunction in how we think, maybe how we feel, how we interact, which is typically the case. We see a lot of social impairment amongst people with personality disorders. And it also might lead to impulsivity. We're actually going to take a closer look at criterion one here on the next slide. But before we do, criterion 2 states that the individual's pattern is significantly different from what's usually found in his or her culture, which is going to be extremely relevant at the end of this lecture. We'll talk more about how culture can influence the diagnosis of a personality disorder. And then criterion 3, the individual experiences significant distress or impairment, right? So these long-term, rigid, wide-ranging patterns, yes, lead to dysfunction, but also significant distress or impairment. So let's take a little bit closer look at that first criterion, because I want to break it down a little bit more so that you guys can kind of understand, how extensive personality disorders can be. So criterion 1 states that the personality disorder includes enduring and rigid patterns of inner experience, outward behavior that leads to dysfunction in various aspects of a person's life. So what's meant by enduring in this criterion is that, yes, the symptoms of a personality disorder, they can last for years. So there's symptoms that the person struggles with, and sometimes, they don't see it as a struggle. They have these symptoms for many, many years. It's personality disorders. It's not a type of mental illness that just all of a sudden emerges and then goes away. That's not the case at all. Usually people with a personality disorder, they experience these symptoms for a significant portion of their life. Personality disorders, what's meant by rigid here is that they typically are inflexible. So while someone with a healthy personality can be flexible depending on a situation, people with a personality disorder are inflexible. So their symptoms exist in whatever situation they are in, whether it's social or whether it's independent or whether it is at work or at school or home with family. It really doesn't matter the situation. They exhibit these symptoms. Personality disorders cause psychological pain for the person as well as other people. However, typically an individual with a personality disorder does not recognize their behaviors as wrong or problematic. So usually it's other people that notice that something is off, something is wrong, something is just different about this individual. And the person with the personality disorder really tends to think that other people have a problem or that other people just don't understand. So that level of insight can definitely be impaired. With respect to the causes of personality disorders, I know I don't have a bullet point here, but if you think back to the slide we just covered, just like personality can be learned or inherited, so can personality disorders. And at the same time, personality disorders are extremely difficult to treat, largely because there's just not a ton of research on personality disorders. There's not a lot of solid understanding of what causes them specifically. While we know that they can be learned, while we know that there's a genetic contribution, exactly how they are learned or the exact genetic contribution or genetic abnormality that causes a personality disorder, it is not well understood. So actually this lecture, it's really going to focus on the symptoms, of the different personality disorders, and I'm not going to cover a lot, or if anything, on causes and treatment, just because the research is really just, it's in its infancy. It really just doesn't, there's no solid convincing evidence for exactly what causes personality disorders, or how to effectively treat them. So again, this lecture will just really focus on symptoms. Personality disorders are typically recognized in adolescence, so you might see some tendencies in an adolescent that might suggest a personality disorder, but it is super important to understand that personalities are not, and typically, there's always exceptions, but typically personality disorders are not diagnosed until at least after the age of 18, if not early adulthood. And the reason, as you'll see, is that some of these personality disorders, the symptoms are kind of common in adolescence. Adolescents are going through a really difficult time, and identity-wise and socially, there's just a lot of awkwardness and growth happening. So typically personality disorders, they are not officially diagnosed until after the age of 18. We'll talk about the prevalence rates in the individual personality disorders, but overall about 15% of adults are believed to have a personality disorder at some point in their lives. And then also noteworthy is that comorbidity. So the existence of another mental illness is extremely common when it comes to personality disorders. So in other words, it is not uncommon for someone to be diagnosed with a personality disorder and another mental illness like depression or substance use disorder or anxiety disorder or something along those lines. So here are, it's the concept map, it's the organization of personality disorders. So here you have the overarching group. And then when it comes to personality disorders, there's 3 specific groups that we'll talk about. We have our group A, our odd eccentric, group B, dramatic emotional, and group C are anxious or fearful disorders. So group A, odd and eccentric, we'll talk about these 3 disorders in that group. Group B will talk about antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. And then group C includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So before we talk about the exact disorders, when it comes to diagnosis, the diagnosis of a personality disorder, it's really important to understand that the DSM-5 takes a categorical approach to diagnosing personality disorders. And what the categorical approach assumes is that problematic personality traits are either present, so the person is either impaired, or they are not impaired. So categorical approach means they either belong in this category or they belong in this category. It's an either or sort of an option, categorical, an either or sort of option. However, even though this is how the DSM diagnoses personality disorder, this assumption is often contradicted by clinical practice. So what's meant by that is that clinicians, even though the categorical approach is what's used in the DSM, clinicians who use that approach aren't really happy with it. The reason is because clinical practice has shown that specific symptoms of personality disorders vary in degree, meaning rather than either the symptom being present or not, that these symptoms can vary in a continuum from either low symptomatology or high, right? So rather than either or, there's various degrees of symptomatology. And what complicates it even further, complicates diagnosis even further, is that the symptoms of personality disorders can overlap. We'll see that here in a second. So it can be, in fact, hard to distinguish one personality disorder from another because symptoms can, in fact, overlap. And then lastly, clinical practice has shown that not only can individuals have another type of mental illness, but it's not uncommon for people with a personality disorder to have more than one personality disorder. So PD meaning personality disorder. It's not uncommon for people to have more than one. So these problems have raised concerns about the validity and reliability of personality disorders. All right, so how accurate are these diagnoses and how consistent are they amongst different clinicians? In other words, if two clinicians were to interview the same client at different times, would they arrive at the same diagnosis? And unfortunately, when it comes to personality disorders, there's a lot of inconsistency here. So, as we go through the different personality disorders, if you find yourself, questioning how similar it is to something else or another disorder, you are not alone. It's probably a very valid and a very common question. So many theorists, despite the DSM's use of the categorical approach, some theorists argue that personality disorders differ more in degree. In other words, they argue for a dimensional approach to diagnosis rather than in type. So personality disorders differ in degree rather in type. So these theorists are arguing for the use of a dimensional approach rather than that categorical. Remember from the previous slide, yes, they have the disorder, no, they don't. Furthermore, what they argue is that to better represent the variations in symptomatology and to help distinguish personality disorders, the DSM should recognize that traits do in fact vary along that continuum. So rather than this categorical approach, use a continuum, use a dimension like this, right? So low to high. Use a continuum, use a dimensional approach in order to better diagnose or more accurately diagnose personality disorders. So the unofficial dimensional approach to the diagnosis of personality disorders, it allows the clinician to rate on two different scales. So in other words, when a person is suspected of having a personality disorder, yes, they get that categorical diagnosis of yes or no. But it's also recommended that they provide a diagnosis along this dimensional approach. The dimensional approach rates the individual on two different continuum. One continuum is based off of the level of impairment. The other continuum is based off of the individual's level of pathological traits. So the next couple of slides will show you what these different scales look like. So here we have the level of impairment scale for an individual with any type of personality disorder. And the clinician will select the level that most closely captures the individual's current overall level of impairment in personality functioning. So the specific components of this level of personality functioning scale are these here. There's the component of self impairment and personal and interpersonal impairment. So considering where an individual is on kind of the collective impairment of self, including their identity, impairment of self-direction, impairment with respect to interpersonal empathy and intimacy, the clinician would give the person an overall rating. Okay, so kind of a average of these 4 areas, 3, 4, an average of these 4 areas would generate a score on this continuum of impairment. So here I've just circled moderate, but of course that's relative to the person. And then the second continuum has to do with the pathological personality traits, where a person is rated on each of the 5 following domains. And the scale is 0 to 3, 0 being minimally descriptive, 3 being maximally descriptive. So the 5 domains includes negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychoticism. So how descriptive are these of the individual with the personality disorder? And to help you understand the kind of the opposite was at the other end of the continuum, then you have negative affectivity versus emotional stability, detachment versus extroversion, and so on and so forth. So once again, the individual would get a rating on each of these 5 different dimensions in order to better capture the level of pathology associated with the person's personality disorder. And if you're not sure, what these different adjectives or labels mean, your text definitely defines them in more detail. But the purpose of this slide is just to help you understand that when a person is diagnosed with a personality disorder, yes, they get that categorical yes, no label or diagnosis, but then it's also recommended, it's not required because it's not official, but it's recommended that they receive ratings on not just level of impairment, but also the pathological personality traits, each of these five dimensions. So this slide here, I've given you this table. So this slide has this table on it. It should be the last page of your student notes there. I like this table because what it does is compare the 10 different personality disorders. So they're listed up here. It compares them on the common symptomatology. So all of these features or all of these symptoms exist within these 10 different personality disorders. And this is what was meant on that previous slide when I talked about how there are overlapping symptoms. You can see on each of the 10 personality disorders, each of them have relationship problems. So the existence of relationship problems doesn't help distinguish if it's paranoid or schizoid or schizotypal, etc. Because all of these disorders involve some type of relationship problem. Now, as you can see, the different shades here, the orange represents a central feature of the disorder. So for example, in schizoid, relationship problems is a central problem, as is being aloof and isolated. So it's these central features and the differences in central features as well as the purple prominent features that help us distinguish between the different personality disorders. So even though they all share relationship problems, you can see that in paranoid personality disorder, it's not the prominent, the central, I'm sorry, it's not the central feature. It is the prominent feature. Rather, in paranoid, the central feature is suspiciousness. Okay, so we'll go through these 10 different personality disorders, but I just want you guys to be able to understand this table and use it when you're trying to distinguish between the 10 different personality disorders. So let's start with Group A. Group A are our personality disorders that involves odd and eccentric features. So each of these can be characterized by odd and eccentric symptomatology. Excuse me. So the 3 disorders in Group A are paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. Now, with respect to these 3 personality disorders, when we talk about the symptoms, they will sound a lot like schizophrenia. And in fact, these symptoms or these disorders do share some symptomatology with schizophrenia. And some clinicians believe that these disorders are actually related to schizophrenia, and so they call them schizophrenia spectrum disorders. The idea is that, again, on a continuum, schizophrenia is at the very far end of severity, but paranoid and schizoid and schizotypal exist on this continuum as well. So they're schizophrenia spectrum disorders in that they exist on the continuum of schizophrenia. Okay, so let's talk about the first disorder, paranoid personality disorder. So the central feature of this disorder is truly a deep distrust and essentially a suspicion of others. And really it can be anyone. So people with paranoid personality disorders are really, they don't trust and they're suspicious of anyone. Family members, acquaintances, employees, colleagues at school, it really doesn't matter. They really just have a pervasive sense of distrust. And the suspicion, it can be inaccurate, right? It's kind of an exaggerated suspicion, but it's not a level of inaccuracy that's delusional. So these individuals, yes, they don't trust people, but it's not delusional like what you would see in full-blown schizophrenia. So people with this disorder, they can always be on guard, believing that they're about to be deceived by someone else. They often are questioning other people's motives. What do you want? Why are you talking to me? You must want something. Why are you looking at me like that? Right? Is there something that you need? Why are you being friends with me? Those types of questions are very common in individuals with a paranoid personality disorder. They typically have a very hard time feeling comfortable with other people because they're constantly questioning what other people want for them or other people's motives. They can be extremely sensitive to other people's casual remarks, or even, like I alluded to in those examples, even how other people look at them. They can interpret that as meaning that somebody wants something, or something they need something, or are out to get them in some way. Prominent features, so less common, but characteristic of paranoid personality disorder is that these individuals, they don't get along with other people, right? And that absolutely makes sense, right? They are socially detached and they might come across as cold or distant because they don't trust people, right? I mean, that makes sense. They don't trust people. Another prominent feature is grandiosity and egocentrism. So those with paranoid personality disorder, they don't see themselves as having the problem, like I alluded to in the overall definition of personality disorder, they typically don't see themselves as making mistakes or having shortfalls. And actually, they blame other people. It's what's your problem? Why are you looking at me? What do you need? Kind of a defensiveness, as stated here on the slide. So defensiveness. And they even can become hostile with other people. So they might also, they can be really critical of other people. Why'd you do that? Sort of a mentality. And so when people don't live up to their own expectations, they can get pretty hostile. And again, the reason is because they believed they're getting attacked, right? They believe that they're being criticized. And so in response, they can be really, really defensive and hostile towards other people. With respect to prevalence rates, paranoid personality disorder, it's much more common in men than it is in women. And I do have a video. I'm not going to play it now for you guys, but you guys can always go to Moodle where you found these notes, and I've included videos under either all of them or most of the personality disorders so that you can either hear more about it or see another example. So other than reading about it in your textbook and listening to this lecture, you can have yet another way to understand what paranoid personality disorder might look like. So let's talk about schizoid personality disorder. The central feature here is relationship problems. So specifically those with schizoid personality disorder persistently avoid social relationships. In other words, they're often described as loners. They have no desire. They lack any sort of desire or inkling for developing any type, much less any type of close relationship. They often prefer solitary activities and they often choose to isolate. And this extends, from acquaintances, making friends and mingling all the way down to a preference to remain unmarried and having any sort of close relationship or alliance to any sort of a friend or anything like that. Prominent features of this disorder. So they have very limited range of emotional expression. So they often appear as flat or cold or humorless. They're often described as dull. So very flat affect or restricted range of emotional expression. They often don't report any sort of personal distress. Okay, so people with schizoid personality disorder are in very little distress because they're essentially choosing that isolation. It's what they prefer, right? And they're not doing so out of fear. It's not because they're not choosing to be alone because they're afraid of other people or because they're afraid of humiliation. It's just something that they like. It's just something that they prefer. They prefer to be alone. And many of these individuals actually live a hermit life, a hermit-like existence where they are just kind of on their own, independent, absolutely free of any sort of, or I shouldn't say free, but, separate from any sort of human contact or connection. And yes, they can fake it, right? When they interact with others, they can be nice and cordial and polite, but they don't like it. If there's any distress, it's when they have to interact with other people. Otherwise, they very much enjoy their loneliness. And this is why it's difficult to treat this disorder. Many people with schizoid personality disorders, they're choosing to be loners. They don't seek treatment because they like to be alone. With respect to prevalence rates, you can see here 3.1%, and it is slightly more common in men. And if you don't recognize the image here, this is Ted Kaczynski, right? The Unabomber, in other words, and he's believed to have suffered from schizoid personality disorder. If you know anything about his story or anything, he was isolated in cabins actually here in Montana and is responsible for several bombings at universities and airports and other facilities. So an example of someone who displayed schizoid personality disorder. And no, not everybody with schizoid personality disorder is a terrorist or is extremely violent. He's definitely a unique, isolated case, but nonetheless, he is an example of schizoid personality disorder. So how about schizotypal personality disorder? Once again, the key feature, the central feature is interpersonal problems. These are individuals that have very few close friends, and they also avoid intimacy. And when they do interact with others, they like those who are schizoid, they experience a lot of discomfort, maybe even some social anxiety. The other central features of schizotypal, or central features and prominent features of schizotypal personality disorder, help distinguish schizotypal from schizoid. These are individuals that not often, but by definition, they have very eccentric cognitive and perceptual experiences. So remember from when I talked about the group A as a whole, these are schizophrenia-like disorders, and schizotypal is actually the personality disorder that is most like schizophrenia. It is most like schizophrenia in the sense that these are individuals that have these cognitive perceptual eccentricities. So ideas of reference, right? So this is that delusion that the media is directly speaking to or talking to the individual, right? So that weatherman on the TV is specifically conveying some hidden message to the person in their weather report. Magical thinking is another type of eccentricity that is really magical thinking. It's like a superstition, but it's more bizarre. Okay, so sometimes, and it's not just more bizarre, but the person truly believes that if they do this, then that will happen, right? If I do Y, then Z will happen. For example, if I get out of bed and step on my left foot, then it will rain today. Okay, it's definitely more bizarre, and the person is more likely to believe it. The person with schizotypal personality disorder is more likely to believe it. The person can also experience bodily illusions, right? So body image disturbances, and not just like body image, like what you see in eating disorders, but just distortions in body, almost like hallucinations with respect to what they feel and what they sense and what they perceive of themselves. Prominent features, excuse me, of schizotypal personality disorder. They too can have some suspiciousness and paranoid ideation. So that idea that other people are out to get them, or that other people have hidden motives, or other people are, excuse me, are, out to get them, have hidden motives, that they need something from them, just kind of that overarching skepticism of other people. And again, it doesn't matter who it is. It can be family, it can be an acquaintance or a stranger on the street. They also can display behavioral eccentricities. That's misspelled, but eccentricities. So what that might look like is odd speech and constricted affect. So the way they talk, odd speech, it can be vague. They might have some neologisms, which we defined in chapter 12. They might also have impaired speech where they have long pauses between their words or sentences. And then constricted affect. Remember affect means mood. So their emotional expression, rather than having that normal range we have, they can definitely be blunted in their ability to express, either being, let's try to write this out, sad or happy. They're kind of always just in the middle, monotone, so, never really up or never really down. So again, like I mentioned, this is the disorder that's most similar to schizophrenia. And then you can see the prevalence rates here, more common in males than females too. So here are group B personality disorders, including antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. And these are disorders that are characterized by either a lot of drama or a lot of emotion, or maybe even a lack of emotion. Okay, so regardless, there's some type of drama or emotional component to these 4 disorders, and that will make more sense as we talk about each of them individually. So antisocial personality disorder, it's a hard one. This is a hard one on a lot of levels because it's pretty intense and can be pretty barbaric. A lot of times people use the term antisocial. Where is it? There it is. Antisocial. Sorry for the scribbling, but a lot of times people use the term antisocial to describe someone who's a loner, right? Oh, they're so antisocial, right? And really that is more reflective of schizoid, the way that term is used. Schizoid personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder does not mean these people are loners. In fact, it's quite the opposite. These are individuals that can be super charming, right? They can look like the guy next door, very nice and humble and attractive, right? Can kind of draw you in, but usually that's because they want something. Okay, they have an agenda. So people with antisocial personality disorder regularly disregard and violate the rights of others. That's what's meant by antisocial. They're antisocial in the sense that they violate the rights of other people. In fact, their violation can extend to criminal behavior. And as your text reports, about 35% of the prison population meets the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, which is super high. That's astronomical because when we look at the rate of antisocial in the general population, it's 3.6. Right? But in the prison population, because these individuals are in fact more likely to commit crimes, we see a much higher representation of antisocial in the prison system. And the types of crimes can be very, very alarming. So it might start out with maybe some robbery and some fire setting and maybe some vandalism, but over time, because these are traits that exist for long periods, the criminalistic behaviors evolve and they become more and more dangerous. So a robbery becomes armed robbery, and fire setting becomes arson, where they're actually destroying public property. Fights and bullying become assaults, physical and sexual assaults, as in rape, and even murder. There are several examples of murderers who have been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, just like Mr. Bundy down here. Okay, so disregarding and violating the rights of others. These are individuals that can be deceitful, very manipulative, and controlling. And the reason they're able to do this is because they don't care about other people. They can lie, they can be cruel and aggressive and violent. They will say what they need to say at any time in order to get something from you. And when it comes to that time to take advantage of you, then they can be very, very, very violent and barbaric. And again, these are individuals that don't care about other people, right? They might appear so. I mean, they put on a great facade, but when it comes right down to it, they're great at faking caring about others. In all intents and purposes, they lack any sort of remorse or shame. And this truly is the hallmark of antisocial personality disorder. When you have people who are committing crimes like physical assaults and murders, sexual assaults and rapes, yet they have no remorse and no shame, right? They might snicker and they might smirk. They might sit at a defense table emotionless. These are individuals that just don't care. In fact, they actually find enjoyment in hurting other people. Other names for these individuals, psychopaths and sociopaths. And the distinction between a psychopath and sociopath, it's a couple nuances that I can elaborate on later, or you can look up for yourself. But psychopath and sociopath, those are in fact terms that are meant to reflect people with antisocial personality disorder. Okay, these are individuals that can also be reckless and impulsive. Okay, so sometimes, they can be very, they can plan their manipulation in an effort to get what they want from other people, but they also can be very, very dangerous. They can take a lot of risks with respect to their relationships, with respect to other impulsive like behaviors such as gambling or driving fast and without seatbelts, substance abuse, and things like that, impulsive behaviors like that. The diagnosis of antisocial requires the person to be 18 or over. Okay, so again, this is a specific diagnosis where it is not diagnosed. Antisocial is not diagnosed in individuals younger than 18. However, the diagnosis specifies that for an individual to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, the patterns, the behaviors that I've talked about up here are present before the age of 15 years old. Okay, so we'll talk about disorders of childhood in chapter 4. I think that's next, chapter 14. And one of those disorders is conduct disorder. Now, when children display the symptoms that I've talked about up here, right? Disregarding and violating the rights of others, like fire setting or delinquency at school, disrespect to authority figures, no sort of compliance with school regulations or even the law, when they're lying and stealing, when they are maybe hurting other people in the form of bullying, or maybe they've even advanced to animal mutilation, right? Those are all symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, but because we're talking about a child, that kiddo would be diagnosed with conduct disorder. So yes, conduct disorder in children is antisocial personality disorder in adults. Okay, when an adult is diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, more likely than not, if you were to look back in their history, you would in fact see symptoms, excuse me, of conduct disorder. Okay, so it's not a disorder that just all of a sudden appears and that person wakes up antisocial. Sorry. Rather, it's a disorder that evolves over time. And you can typically see symptoms in kiddos as young as 6, 7, 8. I've actually at Shodair have seen symptoms in kiddos as young as 2 and 3, believe it or not. And I can tell you more about that later. But the idea is that those symptoms in kiddos evolve over time. And that diagnosis of conduct disorder is essentially necessary and a prerequisite for a diagnosis of antisocial. As you can see, the diagnosis much more common in men. It does exist in women, of course, but men, it's much more common. And with respect to treatment, people always ask, well, how do you treat someone with antisocial? It's complicated. It truly is. If you don't intervene before that early age of 13, 14, 15, chances are, no matter what you do, there's no sort of hope for an individual with antisocial personality disorder. Okay, it's very unlikely. It happens. There's some evidence in case studies of individuals who turn it around, but it's very unlikely to actually have an individual recover from antisocial when the intervention happens as an adult. The next group B personality disorder is borderline personality disorder. In this disorder, the individual experiences several symptoms. And Marsha Linehan is an expert in borderline personality disorder, and she's been quoted as saying that persons with BPD or borderline personality are the psychological equivalent of the burn victim. Everything hurts so bad. If there's one word that we could use to summarize individuals with BPD, it is that they are unstable, to be grammatically correct, but instability overall. Individuals with borderline personality they have instability, and they're essentially unstable in many aspects of their life. So interpersonally, they're unstable, sorry. So this is one of the central features. Actually, let me backtrack here. Let me talk a little bit about this. Personal instability is one of the central features of borderline personality disorder. And what is meant by that? It's not like the interpersonal dysfunction we see in those group A personality disorders. People with borderline personality disorder are rather very chaotic in their relationships. If you're a friend or a family member of someone with BPD, it can be extremely intense. The reason is because people with BPD often vacillate between love and hate very quickly, meaning they either love you or they hate you, right? It's a very, like I said, chaotic interaction with someone with BPD. It's consistently a push, pull, love, hate type of relationship, all within the same breath. They may say something like, I need you, I love you, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. And then if you look at them the wrong way, or if you don't respond to a text in the right amount of time, any sort of nuance like that can trigger them. And they can all of a sudden turn and just hate you. Get away from me. I never want to see you again. So again, it's a very chaotic, often unpredictable relationship. At the core of borderline personality disorder is a fear of abandonment. Okay, it's a fear of abandonment. These are individuals that will push you away because they would rather push you away than you walk away. right? It's much easier for me to push you away than it is to watch you leave me. So that whole push pull, it's I need you, but then I'm going to push you away before you can leave. So it's a very, like I said, chaotic and unstable sense of interpersonal relations. Individuals with BPD are also emotionally unstable. So those with BPD can have a very difficult time controlling and managing their emotions. It's another central feature of the disorder. Essentially, they're very unstable. As I mentioned with the interpersonal instability, they can be very reactive in that many things will set them off into a panic or a fit of rage, or they might become frantic when things don't go their way. And it can be simple things like someone not texting them at the right amount of time, or when someone looks at them the wrong way, or any sort of interaction can be interpreted as unfavorable. People with BPD often experience problems with depression, anxiety, irritability is very common, as kind of exemplified in that interpersonal symptomatology. And they can have a really hard time controlling those emotions, the depression, the anxiety, the irritability, even the anger. Anger is very common in those with BPD. And actually, beyond controlling and managing the disorder, some people with BPD have a hard time labeling their emotion or understanding where it's coming from. So yeah, they might be angry, they might be pissed off, but when you ask them why, they won't know. And if they think they know, it's often about some sort of nuance. Well, you didn't text me when I thought you should, right? But it's actually bigger than that. Their anger, their irritability, their depression, it's much more than just a text, right? It's like walking on eggshells. It's, their irritability is not about the shell cracking, but something else much bigger than that. So it's a very complicated disorder because that level of insight is just often compromised. These individuals, they just don't know. They often describe themselves as feeling empty. So you might ask them how they feel. It's, I don't know. Just, I got nothing. And it's really hard for them to actually verbalize and communicate what's going on inside of them. As a consequence of that they can actually be behaviorally unstable as well. So people with BPD are often extremely impulsive. They're risk takers. They can be promiscuous, and they can actually be not just flaunting themselves and putting themselves out there in a way that's kind of provocative, but they actually can act out and be sexually hyperactive. Another example of risk taking is substance abuse, and then driving, or we'll talk a little bit about that other part I was just going to mention in a second. But spending sprees, I think I've mentioned reckless driving. Those are all examples of risk taking. They can be physically violent towards others. Verbally violent is more common, right? So lashing out in anger with a lot of swear words and accusations is common. They can also be aggressive and violent towards themselves. So those with borderline personality disorder, they can in fact be very self-destructive. And this includes those self-injurious or self-mutilation behaviors, cutting themselves, burning themselves with maybe cigarette butts or lighters, purposely overdosing on medication, but not enough to take their life, but to, again, it's kind of that pushing boundaries, risk-taking type of behavior. So what's behind self-destruction? What's behind self-mutilation? A lot of people say, well, they're just asking for attention. Yeah, you're right, they are. They are asking for attention. They're asking for help. And remember, these are individuals that have a hard time labeling their emotion and identifying where it came from. In fact, it's much easier to act it out than it is for them to verbalize it. So they might cut, they might burn themselves, and they might do things that are self-destructive, but what they're trying to do is communicate that they are hurting inside because they don't have the words. They don't have the ability, the insight to label and explain where that's coming from, where that emotional pain is coming from. So yes, they do act out in a physical way because emotionally they're just not able to. Some people with BPD are suicidal. 75% of people with the disorder attempt suicide. There it is. So 75% attempt suicide at least once, and 10% of individuals with borderline actually die by suicide. So, sometimes people think, oh, they're cutting, it's just for attention, don't give it to them. But it's actually quite the contrary. If someone with borderline personality disorder is cutting, it's really, it's a really big sign that they're needing help and potentially suicidal. So cognitive instability, what this looks like is that individuals with borderline personality tend to think in all or nothing terms. So very similar to the interpersonal love-hate, push-pull relationship. The cognitive instability is indicated by black and white thinking. So things are either all good or they're all bad. And there's really no shades of gray. Things are either wonderful or absolute hell, right? There's nothing really in between. They're either a complete failure or an amazing success. Okay, so again, nothing in between. And then people with borderline personality disorder can also have an unstable sense, sorry for that typo, unstable sense of self. What's meant by that is that they struggle with their identity. Okay, they don't really know who they are. Very similar to how they have a hard time labeling emotions. These are individuals that just are unaware of their values, their preferences, their likes and dislikes. And so oftentimes they will adopt the values and preferences and hobbies and styles of other people around them. They're our chameleons of the group who kind of just go along with the crowd to fit in, but also just to belong, because and that becomes their sense of self. You might ask them, hey, what's your favorite music? And they might say something like, I don't know, what do you like? Right? And I like everything. It just doesn't matter. Whatever's good for me. And it's not like they're trying to be facetious or trying to be, a people pleaser, but they just legitimately, they don't know. Like just that awareness and that insight into who they are and what they want and what they believe in, what they don't believe in is just absent. Okay. With respect to prevalence rates, you see here the general population, and then how this particular disorder, it's definitely more common in women than it is men. And I do have a clip, this is actually two different links, but a clip of an individual with borderline personality disorder that I highly recommend you guys watch. Again, you can find it in Moodle. It's of Becky. And Becky talks about her experience with borderline personality disorder. So following along on our Group B personality disorders, here's histrionic personality disorder. Histrionic, the central feature here is that these are individuals that are extremely emotional, definitely not like what we see in borderline personality disorder. Because these individuals, yes, they're extremely emotional, but there's a very grandiose and egocentric component to their emotionality. So what's meant by grandiose and egocentric is that these are individuals that are that are very full of themselves. Okay, they tend to be very dramatic and all about themselves in any sort of situation. So they might think, that you might say something like, "Oh my gosh, you never believe what happened to me," and they might reply with, "Really?" They try to one up you. "Really? Well, you would never believe what happened to me. I got stuck in traffic for 10 minutes on reserve. It was horrible." Right? That's sort of over dramatizing everyday situations is super common by definition in people with histrionic personality disorder. Prominent features of this disorder, they seek to be the center of attention, so using the drama to bring in other people to be the main focus. But one of the things that's important to understand is that the reason they like to be the center of attention, it's really grounded in a deep-seated low self-esteem. These are individuals that are, even though they might portray themselves like good old Scarlett O'Hara as confident and maybe even promiscuous and flirtatious, they're actually very insecure, full of self-doubt. Okay, this is a distinguishing feature of histrionic personality disorder compared to narcissism, which we'll talk about next. Another prominent feature, these people can be very demanding in relationships, consistently needing something from other people. And in order to do that, they might be provocative, they might be sexually inappropriate, and they might even make suicide attempts. And the reason they do that is to suck people in, to bring them in. Again, they can be demanding in relationships because they want to be that center of attention. These are individuals that are sympathetic, not empathetic. So they might listen to you, but they might respond with, "Well, you should hear what happened to me." Or they might listen to you talk about, your sadness or your grief, and they might say something like, "Well, at least you're able to be, I don't know, at least if your grandma passes away," for example, be a little bit more specific. So if your grandma passes away, they might say something, "Well, at least you had a grandma," right? It's just it's just off-putting and very distracting when individuals respond to your own distress like that. But it's very common in people with histrionic disorder to bring the story, not only one up you with different stories, but also bring the story back around to focus on them. Do you see the prevalence rates there? About 1.8% of adults, and it tends to be equal among men and women. Narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, also indicated by that grandiosity and egocentricity. So these are individuals that come across as arrogant. They might exaggerate their achievements. So even though they might be successful in what they do, they tend to elaborate on how successful, and often at the expense of other people. And they tend to be convinced of their own successes. So what's meant by that is that they're just enamored with their own self, right? They are successful, and so they believe that other people should just be basically just grateful to be within their own presence because of how wonderful they are. So in this sense, they expect admiration from other people. Another central feature is that these are individuals that are self-absorbed, but not like individuals with histrionic personality disorder. These are individuals, they are not self-critical. Okay, whereas histrionic personality disorder is marked by that low self-esteem, right? And that's what drives them to be the center of attention, right? Needing validation from other people. That's histrionic. Narcissism, these individuals, they don't really care what other people think, right? Yes, they might be, trying to exaggerate their achievements to others, but really they could care less about other people's work, about other people's achievements, and about what other people think. And they tend to have even less empathy as well as less sympathy for other people. Right? They just completely disregard other people's opinions and thoughts and feelings, really. And so you can see here the prevalence rates of narcissism and how it tends to be overrepresented in men. All right, so then our last group of personality disorders are our anxious and fearful disorders, avoidant, dependent, and OCPD. Avoidant personality disorder. So yes, relationship problems. Central feature, as is most of our personality disorders, involve an element of relationship problems. These are individuals that do have few friends. However, these are individuals that actually desire relationships. Okay, they actually do wish they could have friends and close relationships with others. But the reason they have relationship problems and few friends is because they feel inferior to other people. Okay, so they feel like if they were to have a close friend, that friend would actually validate that they are less than, that they are not as good as their friend. So they distance themselves from other people, right? They don't take the risk of having a friendship because they're afraid that friend will validate that they are actually an inferior person. So these are individuals that also can be extremely sensitive to criticism because they do have that inferiority complex already, where they just feel like they are not good enough. So any type of criticism can be really detrimental to these individuals and continue to drive them to avoid establishing friendships. Prominent features that might help you understand the disorder a little bit more is that these are individuals that are very self-critical. So very similar to, what I was talking about obviously above, is that they're really hard on themselves. Not only do they have that inferiority complex, but anything they do, the way they talk, the way they speak, the way they work, the way they interact, the way they play games or do hobbies, anything, whatever they do, they're very pessimistic, right? They also can experience depression, report being lonely. I mean, again, they wish they could have friends. They do want friends. But because of their low self-esteem, they're unable to. Now, this is a disorder that is similar to social phobia. Remember, way back in chapter 4, we talked about social phobia. And it's similar, avoidant is similar to social phobia in that there is in fact a fear of humiliation and low self-confidence. Avoidant personality disorder, these are people that avoid relationships because they're afraid of being humiliated, right? Because they have that low self-confidence. So how do avoidant and social phobia differ? Those with social phobia fear social situations in which might lead to embarrassment. So talking in public, eating in public, writing in public, singing in public, anything in public. They avoid public or social situations for the fear of humiliation. People with avoidant fear close social relationships. So the fear of having intimate relationships, one-on-one friendships, as well as partners, sexual relationships can be very, very scary for these individuals. So again, the key difference is social phobia fears social situations, avoidant personality fears those close one-on-one relationships. And yeah, there are critics who argue that avoidant personality disorder sounds so much like social phobia that it too should be classified as an anxiety disorder. And we might see that change in the next version of the DSM, but for now, avoidant is in our group C of personality disorders. And then you can see the prevalence rates there and how this disorder is equally represented in men and women. So dependent personality disorder, moving right along, also characterized by relationship problems, but it's different. The type of relationship problem that exists is different from what we've seen, and that these are individuals that have persistent, excessive need to be taken care of. These are individuals that are very clingy and have a difficult time with separation. Okay, so they're constantly checking in with other people, constantly needing to be around other people. And why? Why are they so clingy? Why do they have a difficult time with separation? Why do they need to be taken care of or feel like they need to be taken care of? It's because they are plagued with self-doubt, helplessness, and inadequacy. So that low self-esteem. Okay, it's kind of like avoidant in that sense, where these are individuals that are very, very insecure and they are reliant on other people. Right now, it's one thing. We all need people, right? We all look, or hopefully, look to others for social support in time of need. It's a very healthy thing to look for others or to look to others when we are hurting or when we need social support. But it's another thing to be so plagued with self-doubt that we cannot make any sort of decisions on our own. And that's the case with people with borderline personality disorder. Even the daily decisions, they will often reference or check in with other people because they just don't know. They don't know what to do. These are individuals that do have a lot of anxiety and tension, and that's because of their fear of abandonment. Right? They need to be taken care of. They want to be taken care of. So that fear of abandonment, that constant fear of, if someone not replying soon enough in a text, or someone not making eye contact, or someone who's running late for an appointment, whatever, it can provoke a lot of tension and anxiety because that person automatically assumes that they're alone, that they're being abandoned. These are individuals that have a high risk for, let me go back here and I have to discard those, move my picture, because apparently I didn't do that right. Like on the schizophrenia slides. But these are individuals high risk for depression, anxiety disorders, as well as suicidality. Okay. And you can see the prevalence rates. It's actually pretty rare, dependent personality disorder, less than 1%, and how it's equal between men and women. All right, so our last personality disorder is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, this disorder, it is not like the disorder obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Remember, that is an anxiety disorder. So please make sure you understand that obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder. We talked about in chapter 4 that's associated with those interfering obsessions and those compulsive behaviors. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is not about having obsessions and compulsions. These are individuals that are extremely controlling and perfectionistic, right? A great example is good old Monica from Friends, right? Extremely perfectionistic. So she has a plan, and if that plan is not followed to the T, she becomes angry and hostile and irate and frustrated. Right? So a lot of negativity associated with when things don't go as planned. Okay, it can be very triggersome for an individual with OCPD. So they do have relationship problems because these are individuals that not only have high expectations for themselves, but they have high expectations for other people, right? So not only do they expect themselves to be perfect, but they expect those around them to be perfect, to rise to those high expectations. In fact, they actually don't even like working with other people or group projects or things like that because they believe that other people won't or can't pull their own weight. They believe that other people can't follow through, and especially they can't follow through to the same degree that they expect of themselves or for that other person. So they do. They often blame other people when things don't go the way that is planned, when things are not perfect. They often blame others rather than looking at their own contribution. And as I mentioned, they can get pretty hostile when things don't go their way. And so, again, just to be a little bit more specific, OCPD is different than OCD. Okay, so OCPD, these are individuals, OCPD do not have obsessions or compulsions. Okay, so I don't know why they named this disorder so close to OCD. It sounds like these individuals would have obsessions and compulsions, but they don't. Those with OCPD are extreme perfectionists. Okay, and then you can see the prevalence rates down there. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about are the multicultural factors when it comes to diagnosing a personality disorder. The DSM-5, remember, defines a personality disorder in the sense that, excuse me, that the individual the traits they have deviates markedly from the expectation of the individual's culture. Okay. So that's in the definition, the diagnosis of personality disorders. So the influence of culture is important in this diagnosis. However, very little multicultural research has actually been conducted on personality disorders. Okay, so not much research has been conducted. So despite that, though, despite the lack of research, despite the lack of evidence, clinical theorists actually believe there are cultural differences in personality disorders. So this lack of multicultural research is especially important when we consider personality disorders, and especially borderline personality disorder. So remember that 75% of those with this disorder are female. Yet, it can be. So yes, I should say, yes, it might be biological, where women are more prone because of the way we're wired to develop borderline personality disorder. But it may be that this diagnosis actually reflects the extraordinary traumas, as your text describes them. This diagnosis may reflect the extraordinary traumas that many women are subjected to as children, including sexual abuse and violence, emotional trauma. Many theorists argue that it's almost like a prerequisite for borderline personality disorder, and that the disorder, they argue, it actually should be viewed and treated like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And other multicultural theorists believe that borderline personality disorder may actually be a reaction to persistent feelings of marginality, powerlessness, and social failure that have resulted from social inequities, right? So social inequities like sexism, racism, or homophobia, right? So the marginality and powerlessness and social failure are consequences from sexism, racism, or homophobia. However, because of the lack of multicultural research, looking at personality disorders, and I have reach here, it's supposed to be research, but because of the lack of multicultural research, alternative explanations such as these are underdeveloped. So it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that we lack this type of multicultural research. And the hope is that as the experts learn a little bit more about personality disorders, that there will be more money and time invested in the multicultural research of personality disorders so that we may in fact better understand their causes. Maybe better understand their causes, and that could lead to more effective and more standard forms of treatment. But until then, we are working with what we got and hoping that those with personality disorders can be identified, can be recognized sooner than later, because the earlier the intervention, whether that is the various forms of therapies discussed in your book, like medication or cognitive behavioral therapy alone, maybe some humanistic approaches, can be of some benefit.